today. So, like Mike mentioned, I'm going to be talking about web components for authentication. And I'm Anna Cidre. I'm a developer advocate at Auth0. Mike's already mentioned that, but Auth0 is a flexible drop-in solution to add authentication and authorization services to your applications. So if you have any questions about Auth0 web components or just want to say hi, feel free to reach out to me at @AnnaCidre_ on Twitter. My DMs are open, so feel free. And Mike's already mentioned that I'm pretty involved in the community. I'm the founder of NG Spain and Gals Tech. NG Spain, I think, explains itself what it is. It's an Angular conference here in Spain. And Gals Tech is actually a local group to promote women in tech and also help them if they want to get started into tech. And I am a Women Tech Maker Ambassador, which is a program by Google. So as you can see, I'm trying my best in the diversity and inclusion scene and trying to help others. So let's get started. Like I mentioned, this talk is about web components for authentication. So what is a web component? A web component is a component that is completely platform agnostic. So this means that we can run it across several platforms, right? And their main goal is to be encapsulated so that we don't have any styling or behavioral leakages in or out. And we can also make them into small packages which we can then reuse across teams to gain maximum interoperability. Now, I'll go a bit more into depth about this in just a bit. But when we tend to think of web components, we tend to think that they are pure stateless components, UI components. However, that's not true. And throughout this talk, we're going to go from a stateless to a stateful component to get a better understanding of how we can build these. So web components is the umbrella term of three main technologies: HTML template, custom element, and shadow DOM. HTML template is our HTML tag. It's called template. It's nothing new. It's been around for a while. And that's where we put our template of the web component. Next, we have our custom element. And this is where things get a bit tricky because people tend to I've heard it that people sometimes use web components and custom elements interchangeably. However, custom element is under the umbrella of web component. And this is actually how we create the HTML tag, or we can extend or improve an existing one. Just note that when we do give them a name, we need to add a dash so the browser knows that it's a web component. And also make sure you make them understandable and legible so people know what they are. It's always best practice, right? Just like when you call a variable name. And last but not least, we have our shadow DOM. So this is what's going to allow us to encapsulate the web components so that we won't have any styling leakages in or out. So no more going into a general CSS style sheet, changing something and getting your component all messed up. That won't happen anymore. So let's go and create a stateless component. And this is what we're going to create. It's a simple UI login button. It's a black one. You might see some funkiness going on there in the style attribute. If you're not familiar with CSS custom variables, don't worry. We're going to take a look at that in just a second. And we are going to call it login button. So let's go and do that. First, we create our template. And inside our template, we have our styling. And we're going to styling in just a bit. But what we have is just a simple button with an ID of login button. Next, we're going to create our custom element. And to do so, we first call our class. In this case, we're going to call it login button element. And it's extending the HTML element. That way, what we're doing is inheriting all of the features from the HTML element class, and it can also be recognized as a DOM element. We then call our constructor, in which we have super, so we have all of those access to the parent's APIs, and then we are creating our template here. Next, what we need to do is add our shadow DOM. And this is pretty simple. It's just 2 lines of code. The first one is where we add it and we call mode open. We can also call mode close. Now, the difference is if we call open, we're giving the other developers the possibility to manipulate the structure of your component through JavaScript. And there are many reasons to do this. Now, say, for example, I want to create an image gallery on my web app. And I want to do this with a web component. Now, for me, it's just a simple image gallery. It's not going to have any additional use, right? But say someone comes in from the native mobile world and decides that this might actually be a good slider on mobile, not just an image gallery or whatever. Now, if we leave this open, they have the possibility to manipulate this component and adjust it to their needs, basically. But if you don't want to allow this, you can always close it. And on the second line, all we're doing is cloning our template, and instead of adding it to the DOM, we add it to the shadow DOM. Right. The last step is to actually define the custom element. We need to give it a name, right? So we call custom elements.define, we give it a name, remember to add the dash, make it legible. In this case, we said we'll call it login dash button, that's what we're doing here. And then we have the login button element there. And that's it. That's how we create a simple login button. We do have some callbacks going on there, but we will go into that in just a bit when we get to the stateful part. Right, so remember how I said we're going to go back to styling? Well, now it's time to talk about styling, and I want to pause here a minute because styling is really important. Because even though I created a simple black login button, I'm not sure how many people want a black login button on their page. They might want a pink one, or they might want a yellow one, or they might want a transparent one with some funky borders going on. You never know. So there's two ways to go about this. And the first one is with CSS custom properties. And this is the preferred way because of the browser. Here you can see that the major browsers are fully stable when it comes to CSS custom properties. Internet Explorer will always be Internet Explorer, and there's nothing more to say there. So how do we do this? Right, so inside of our template, when we style our web component, what we need to do is when we call our properties, we call var, we open parentheses, we give the variable name. Note that CSS variables always start with 2 dashes. I called it the same as the property name, just something I like to do, but again, make sure it's legible and understandable. You can give it a name of your choice. And then default color, which here I put coffee, which isn't actually coffee color, it's a turquoise, but there you go. And then what the developer does is when they call the login button, in the style attribute, they call that CSS variable name. So dash dash the CSS variable, and then they give it the color of their choice or whatever values they need to there. And that's pretty simple. But as you can imagine, this can become pretty tedious because say you have a big web component with lots of CSS properties that you want developers to be able to change. This is tedious for you and for them. It's a bit more bug prone too, but there's always a solution, right? And there is CSS shadow parts. So if you want to know more about this, I really recommend that you go read this article that I put there. I will post these slides later on my Twitter. And I will also pass them on to Mike so that he can share them with you all. And the article is by Monica, and she goes into depth on this topic, and it's a fantastic article. Actually, the example I'm going to use in just a bit is from this article, so I really recommend that you go check it out. The problem with CSS shadow parts is that the browsers aren't quite ready. I know that Safari is currently working on it, so hopefully that will be ready soon, and things will get up to speed. So what's so cool about this part pseudo class? Well, say you have a more complex web component, say like a form or a card. Let's just say for the sake of this example that it might be a form where you have a div and an input and then another div. And you want the first div and the input to be stylable from the outside. However, you don't want the other div, for whatever reason, not to be stylable. All you need to do is call the part attribute there and you give it a name. And then what the developer does is in their style sheet, they call the web component, the part pseudo class, put the name in there, and you can add whatever pseudo classes you want to on top of that. So hover, placeholder, whatever you need to there. And this way you don't have to add every single CSS variable. You just put it in your style sheet. So let's add it to our login button because we can totally do that. Even though it's not a complex web component, we can still use it. We call the part attribute there, we give it the name custom button. Remember how our web component was called login-button? Well, that's what we put there. We then put the part pseudo class, and then inside of there, we put the name of the part, which is the custom button, and then we change whatever properties we want to there. Pretty nice, pretty simple. And there we have it, our stateless component. Now, as you can see, you can add whatever attributes you want to that are natives there, and it's not an issue. So now that we've got a basic understanding of what web components are, Let's go on to the second part, because this talk is called Web Components for Authentication. So what is authentication? Authentication is the process of confirming an identity. So what do I mean by this? It's when a user or an application proves they are who they say they are by providing valid credentials. So these credentials tend to be username and password. However, they can be combined sometimes with other elements called factors. And these factors fall into three categories: what you know, what you have, or what you are. And it's actually best practice to do this, not just have a username and password, but combine it with other factors just to secure your application a bit more. So now we know what authentication is. Sometimes I hear that authentication and authorization are used interchangeably, and this isn't quite correct, because authorization is what happens after authentication. It's actually the process of verifying what a user has access to. So once a user or application is granted access to an API, that's when authorization kicks in and the API determines the extent of the permissions it should assign. So it's basically once authentication is done, the API knows what access it should grant to a user. Just note that access to a resource is actually protected by both of these, authentication and authorization. However, for the sake of this talk, we're just going to be focusing on authentication. So how can a web component-based ecosystem help when approaching authentication? And this isn't only valid for authentication, but I will be giving authentication examples. First of all, and for me this is the most powerful one, is its maximum interoperability. And to give you a good understanding of what I mean by this, I'm going to give you an example. Now, imagine an enterprise company that has several teams, several product teams. On each team, their product has different styling and whatever it may have. But at the end of the day, they all belong to the same company and they all want a good user experience. But these teams are working with different frameworks. We might have one that's working with Angular, another one that's working with Vue, and another one that's working with Svelte. If we were to create a login process for each of these teams, it would take 3 times the amount of time because each team would have to create it in their framework. And this would cause 3 times the amount of headaches, 3 times the amount of sleepless nights, and so forth. So what could we do? We could create a web component and we could then just share that web component across teams. Pretty simple, huh? Now, if you want to know if the framework you're using is actually compatible with web components, I really recommend this website by Rob Dodson. It's called Custom Elements Everywhere. It's a good source to have, and that way you know what frameworks actually support web components. The next thing I want to mention is that web components are really, really easy to implement. If we take a look at an SDK, which is already a big, big step forward because you don't want to reinvent the wheel, you don't want to spend months building something new, you can just use a software as a service or whatever you may have available, and you use an SDK. This might take a few hours, might take a few days, maybe even a few weeks, but it's still not months or years. With a web component, you just plug in this HTML, add the attributes you need, and you're good to go. Don't forget to do an npm install and save it first though, otherwise it's obviously not going to work. When we create web components, one of the major advantages we have is that we can build them however we want to. So we can put whatever HTML attributes we need to there. Now, in this talk in a bit, we're going to take a look at how we make that stateless component into a stateful component. And for that, we're going to need the domain and client ID. So we're going to add those as attributes. But you can add whatever you may need to there. And we've already taken a look at styling, right? So we've seen that that's a massive advantage. And there's 2 ways to go about it. It's up to you. It's up to what you think your client's needs are. And we also have slots, which gives us again more flexibility for us and also for other developers. So say, for example, you have a login button and a logout button. You might want a description next to that, like, welcome to my application, whatever it may be. Well, a slot could be a placeholder, and then the developers then decide whether they want to use this or not. Just remember that when you do use a slot, try to always use a name, even if you have just one. Because if you have more than one, the browser is just going to render it randomly. So remember to name your slots. And then the developer inside of the web component adds that slot there. Pretty simple. So what sort of web components could we create to make authentication simple? Because this is what we want to do, right? Well, maybe it could be a login screen that has those buttons for social login. It might be a web component that shows the name of the logged in user, and maybe when it's clicked on, it might show a logout button, or it might show a user profile. It depends what we want to achieve. What we're going to do now is we're going to take that login button that we built, and we're going to add Auth0 to it, and that way we're going to deal with the authentication process without the use of SDKs when using the web component. So remember that stateless component we just built? Let's go make it stateful. To do so, what we need to do is add the Auth0 SDK. To do this, we do an npm install of Auth0, auth0-spa-js. We then import it, and what we need to do then, because like I said, what we need to be able to do is allow people to add their own domain and client ID properties to their applications. So we need to add that here, and we call this .domain and this .client ID. We leave them empty because that's what's going to be added from external developers. And we have our getters and setters. We have getters and setters of domain and client ID. Now, if you take a look here at the bottom of both setters, we have this .build Auth0 client. And we have this because we need to rebuild the Auth0 client whenever the values of the domain and or client ID properties change. So next up, we have our static property of observed attributes, and this is returning an array with the names of the component's attributes. And this property asks the browser to be notified whenever any of these values of these attributes changes, right? And then you can actually capture these notifications from the browser by implementing the attribute change callback. Now, this is one of the methods that's called the custom element reaction, and you can implement this to handle some events in the lifecycle of the component. Then we have another custom element reaction, which is the connector callback, and this is called when your component is added to the page's DOM. And in here, what we're doing is creating an instance of the Auth0 client. We're adding an event listener, which is listening for a click event, and then we're managing the result of the authentication. And finally, we're updating the UI based on the current authentication status. So let's go take a look at this a bit closer, starting with the click event. All we're doing here is getting the current authentication status, and then we're calling the login and logout methods accordingly. Let's go into these methods. And what we have here is we're invoking the login with redirect and the logout methods of the Auth0 client. We're going back to our connector callback, and we're going to take a look at our update UI method, which basically does what it says. It's displaying the correct text on the login button based on the current authentication status. And then we have our handle redirect callback, which is managing the response coming from the Auth0 server after authentication. So we've basically done. We basically made our stateful component. Now, if you want to take a look at this, you can go to my code here and test it and try it out and give me feedback. Do any PRs if you feel like you need to. That would be great. And so what would happen? If you clicked on the login button, it would take you to this amazing Ioniconf login screen because we totally need one of these. And then you can sign in with your social media, and then basically when you're signed in, you can log out. That's what it does, but you can add whatever features you want to there. So it's pretty cool. And I forgot to mention earlier that if you have any other ideas of what web components we could build for login or authentication, please feel free to tweet them at me. I'm really excited to hear about your ideas, and I'd love to try to build some of those too. So you might have noticed that I used native JavaScript to build this web component. However, there are many tools out there that you can actually use to build them. And one really great one is actually Stencil. I highly recommend this. And Another one we have is Lit Element, we have Slim, we have Skate, we have Hybrid, we have Angular Elements. It all depends on personal preferences. I really recommend you go try them out. It's not far-fetched. Like, if you know React, it's pretty similar to that, some of them, especially Lit Element. And I really just recommend that you go try them out and let me know. Now, I know one big issue is the browser, because when web components first came out, the browsers were not ready. There were a lot of issues. Polyfills were very, very big. There were 17K, so that's very big. And also, they didn't quite work as expected, especially the Shadow DOM part. So a lot of people lost hope. And today I hear a lot of people saying that why web components, they don't work properly. And I was like, yeah, they really do now. You should really try them again, give them a second chance. Come on. And just to show you that I'm not lying, like, take a look at this browser support. It's fully stable across all browsers, even Edge with Chromium is fully stable. So I would just say go ahead, test them out, try them out. Let me know if you have run into any problems, and I'll be more than happy to help. So thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. I'm also an organizer of a conference, so I know how difficult this is, especially online. And thank you all. That's my Twitter.